Two friends, Daniel and Chris, graduated the same year, took jobs in the same mid-sized city, and earned nearly identical salaries for the next 2 decades. At 27, Chris bought a $310,000 house, putting down $62,000 and financing the rest over 30 years. Daniel rented a comparable apartment nearby for $1,450 a month and invested the difference between his rent and what Chris was paying in mortgage, taxes, insurance, and maintenance into a simple low-cost index fund, along with the $62,000 he never spent on a down payment. 20 years later, Chris had paid off roughly a third of his mortgage balance and owned a home now worth approximately $540,000 after 2 decades of appreciation in a moderately priced market. After subtracting his remaining loan balance, his equity stood at around $290,000. Daniel, who had never owned a single square foot of property in those same 20 years, had an investment account worth $710,000. This runs directly against one of the most repeated pieces of financial wisdom in America: the idea that renting is simply throwing money away while buying builds wealth automatically. The assumption isn't baseless. Homeownership has genuinely built substantial wealth for millions of American families, and in many markets and time periods, buying has clearly outperformed renting. But the blanket assumption that a house is always the superior financial choice ignores a set of real costs that get quietly excluded from the comparison almost every time it's made casually, and those excluded costs are exactly what separated Daniel's outcome from Chris's. The first excluded cost is the opportunity cost of the down payment itself. Chris's $62,000 was locked into his house the day he bought it, earning him nothing directly except a lower loan balance. Daniel's $62,000 went into the market immediately and, left untouched for 20 years at a 7% average annual return, grew to roughly $240,000 on its own, before a single additional dollar was ever added to it. This single piece of the comparison, rarely mentioned when someone insists that renting wastes money, was worth nearly as much as Chris's entire home equity by itself. The second excluded cost is ongoing homeownership expense that never shows up in a mortgage payment comparison. Property taxes, homeowners insurance, and routine maintenance typically run 1.5% to 2.5% of a home's value annually. On Chris's home, that worked out to roughly $5,000 to $7,000 a year that Daniel simply never paid, money that went toward his rent instead, an amount that, while real, was frequently lower than Chris's true all-in monthly housing cost once taxes, insurance, and maintenance were included, alongside his mortgage principal and interest. The third piece, and the one that actually determined Daniel's outcome more than any other single factor, was discipline. Daniel didn't simply avoid buying a house and passively end up wealthy. Every single month for 20 years, he took the gap between his rent and Chris's full housing cost, often $300 to $600 depending on the year, and moved it directly into his investment account before he had a chance to spend it on anything else. This is the part of the renting versus buying comparison that rarely gets acknowledged honestly. Renting only outperforms buying when the money not spent on a house actually gets invested, consistently, for decades. Renting and simply spending the difference on a nicer lifestyle produces an outcome far worse than Chris's, not better. This is precisely why the conventional wisdom about homeownership building wealth automatically persists so strongly, and why it isn't entirely wrong. For a large share of Americans, a mortgage functions as an effective forced savings mechanism specifically because it removes the temptation Daniel had to resist every single month. A mortgage payment doesn't ask for willpower. It's simply due, whether or not the homeowner feels disciplined that month. Chris built substantial, genuine wealth through his home specifically because the structure of a mortgage did the saving for him automatically, in a way his own unassisted discipline might never have matched. The comparison also depends heavily on local market conditions that vary enormously by city and by decade. In markets where home prices are unusually high relative to rents, coastal cities being the clearest recent example, the gap between renting and the true all-in cost of owning tends to be large enough that even a modestly disciplined renter-investor can outperform a buyer over long periods. In markets where homes are priced more reasonably relative to rents, the advantage frequently tilts back toward ownership, particularly over multi-decade holding periods where appreciation and mortgage paydown compound substantially. None of this means Daniel made the objectively correct decision and Chris made the wrong one. It means the decision was never as simple as the popular wisdom suggests, and the actual outcome depended on a set of specific, calculable variables: the local price-to-rent ratio, ongoing ownership costs, and above all, whether the money not spent on a house actually got invested rather than spent, that gets skipped over almost every time someone repeats the assumption that renting is inherently wasteful. Chris, for what it's worth, has no regrets about his choice, and reasonably so. Owning a paid-down $540,000 home free of a mortgage in another decade is a genuinely strong outcome by almost any measure. But Daniel's $710,000 quietly accumulated in a brokerage account while friends and family spent 2 decades assuming he was falling behind by not buying a house, is the part of this story that rarely gets told, mostly because it requires the one ingredient that's much harder to sell than a mortgage ever was: the discipline to actually invest the difference, month after month, for 20 uninterrupted years, with nothing forcing him to do it except the decision itself.